So we're talking about the Botanic Gardens and the State Herbarium. The things that most people know are obviously the gardens, the living collections, the things that the public interact with every day. And it's a really interesting thing because the Botanic Gardens as an institution is the most visited attraction in South Australia. So people have this connection to nature, and we don't need to put on a rock concert or play cricket or football. We'll get those sorts of people come through. Then obviously there's the State Herbarium and the seed bank as the scientific collections. But there's other stuff. And this is what I look after: the library, the archive, the art collection, the Museum of Economic Botany, its exhibition program. And if we drill down through that stuff a little bit, we have things like thousands of books, including rare books, thousands of journal titles, 50,000 slides, covering the second half of the 20th century, 4,000 black and white historic photos, some fantastic glass lantern slides, thousands of objects, including a carpological collection in the museum, artworks and scientific illustrations, shelves of archival records, and then things like statues and fountains and objects and etc. So the value of these things, it needs to be discussed within the context of how they're collected and displayed. And if we take something like this, for example, that's Ficus Walk, you'll recognise the next photo. The trees themselves embody some scientific knowledge and information, but the photo allows us to look at things like growth rate of the trees, and I'll leave that to the botanists. Because when you all say, I'm a botanist, I say, am I a botanist? But in this photo, you'll see a bit of Adelaide history. So these enclosures are animal enclosures. That's the origin of the zoo that later on moved across the road, or across the river. That's Ficus Walk now. So when we talk about collections in the Botanic Gardens and collection policy and things like that, I show these two photos and don't say anything. And people say, what's this all about? And it's about collecting or planting today for the future. So the living collection is all about peace, beauty and tranquility for visitors. Sometimes we formalise that and focus on education, so that's the Mediterranean garden. It's designed as a demonstration garden, so we understand how important conserving water is, and showing that we can have a beautiful garden in our backyard or front yard if we understand the notion of climate. Then we have things like an art collection. That's Rosa Fiveash. She was commissioned by people like Rogers, Edney Brown and Cleland. The work was created for scientific purposes, but I think this work also has broader appeal. A couple of years ago we lent some of this work to the art gallery for an exhibition called South Australia Illustrated, and currently I'm working on producing a catalogue and an exhibition on Fiveash to make that a bit more accessible to the general public. Because I think someone like Fiveash is not as well known as she should be, so we'll try and resolve that. A few years ago we were really fortunate. A very generous benefactor donated the Banks Florilegium to us. We put that on as an exhibition, and we focused obviously on the botany, the history, but also on the art and the printmaking. Our library is full of some fantastic rare books, some dating back to the 16th century, like this herbal by Dioscorides, linking back to the days that botanic gardens during the Renaissance were formed. That's Fuchs's herbal. And getting a bit closer to now, the 19th century, the library collection reflected the living collection. That's Hooker and Fitch's Victoria Regia. Now, Richard Schomburgk, who was the second director of the gardens, along with his brother Sir Robert, are credited with the European discovery of the Amazon water lily. And it's a very important plant, an iconic plant for the Adelaide Botanic Garden. But when the Schomburgs were in South America, they were also interested in the connection between plants, people and culture. So objects like this appear in our collection, and when we first unravelled this object, we didn't know where it came from. Delving into the archives at the Kew Botanic Gardens, we found distribution books and letters which clearly gave us a true understanding of where these objects came from. So that cassava grater, for example, collected in Brazil, sent back to London, and in 1879 sent by Hooker to Schomburgk for the new museum. So we put that together and tell the story of cassava in the Museum of Economic Botany. So there's cassava flour and a piece of cassava bread. Now, the Victoria Amazonica is a really important exotic plant for the Botanic Gardens. That's Lucy Gilpin. I think her father was the head gardener about 100 years ago, and she's floating on one of the leaves. That sort of thing was happening all over the world. There was a race to flower this exotic plant, and in Adelaide we built the Victoria House, and in 1868 about a quarter of the population streamed through during the month of October to see this flower. And today, well, that's not quite today, a few years ago, we built a new glass house around the original pond, so preserving some of the history and making sure that that story can be told into the future. Now, that glass house took as its inspiration Joseph Paxton's first sketch of the Crystal Palace. Now, the Crystal Palace was inspired by the architecture of the leaf of the Amazon water lily, which, as you saw, could hold a young girl. It's paper thin, but its architecture allowed that weight to be held up. So the Crystal Palace ends up being the forerunner to the massive glass and steel skyscrapers that fill our cities. And so that story of glass that's told in the 19th century or the 21st century can also be told through our bicentennial conservatory in 88. We can go back to the Palm House in 1877, or we can take that glass thing a bit further. It's a glass lantern slide, hand-coloured, beautiful as an object, tells us a story by the subject of the image, but is also an artefact of the history of photography and the way, we're using PowerPoint. The magic lantern slide was the way they'd be doing that years ago. And today, if you walk into the museum, there's a fantastic art show by Tom Moore called Watching Glass Grow, and the underlying themes of this exhibition are the environmental conundrum that we find ourselves in and the possibilities of evolution. His main thinking is what happens when we're all gone. And so we present things like that through the museum. And the museum was built in 1879 and opened in 1881. It was all about finding that connection between plants and people. Now, the other stuff that we've been talking about today helped us restore this museum. So the photographs and the reports and the documented records allowed us to peel back all the changes that have been made over the last 100 years and return the museum to what it was, outside and inside. And then when we look at that museum, we can go back and explore the collection in a bit more detail. So one of the first things I came across was these boxes of what I was told were wax apples wrapped up in tissue paper. And as we were putting the museum back together, we found out that they were actually made out of paper mache, and we had them on subscription from 1865 through to 1899. And we found things like receipts letting us know what they cost. And we put them on display. We produced a book about the museum, and a couple of paragraphs described everything we knew about that story. Later on, when we had a bit more time, the royal we, it's just me, I went through, catalogued each one, started to unravel the story, and found a really interesting fact in these apple models were sent all over the world. There were hundreds of these collections, and they stopped making them in 1899. And this photo is the Mylor type orchard around 1900, when the Botanic Gardens were growing 1,000 different apple varieties. And the models had done their job. The models were all about suggesting varieties for cultivation, and the apple and pear industry took that on board, and we ended up having a really successful industry in South Australia. So with that story, with a bit more meat to the story, we photographed the collection a bit more beautifully, produced a book. The book was well received in the cider world, but the apple and pear industry, the food and wine, they really liked it. It was reviewed in Huntier, in their Journal of Botanical History. Is that me? 2 minutes, done. But the museum world and the art world really appreciated the way that story was put together and presented, and that book ended up being awarded Best Museum Book in Australia in 2014. Along the way, we discovered there was a collection of wax apples made in South Australia for the International Exhibition. These three are the only remnants of a huge collection that numbered hundreds that were tossed out in 1933. So the link between international exhibitions and the museum, I'll just skim through this, is quite powerful. Schomburg would send objects over and plants, and in return get objects for the museum and plants for the garden. That case just shows an exchange that happened. And we could go on and talk about statues and artworks and things like that, but I'll just wrap up now. One of the things we did a few years ago was we sought accreditation through the American Alliance of Museums. That takes the Botanic Gardens and State Herbarium and essentially treats it as a museum of all of these collections, not just the Museum of Economic Botany, but all of the collections. And I think that's a very good way to consider what a Botanic Gardens is. A museum of living plants, dead plants, seeds, and all the other stuff. So the value of the other stuff, I think, is in connecting the science of plants and nature to the consumers of art, history, and culture. And that's an example. Thank you.